Good day, investors. Welcome. I'm your host, Jared Bowers. In addition to your host, I try to be your storyteller sometimes. And I left the story from our last episode open-ended, didn't I? It was unresolved. Well, that's just part of it sometimes. All of our lives are unresolved stories, and we should hope that they remain that way. But there is a continuation of that story of the brothers, Alex and Brad. After asking himself and a few people close to him, "What the heck am I doing wrong?" Brad recognized that he was stuck in a short-term loop of never seeing past today or the weekend at the farthest. Maybe it helped that he'd recently started listening to a certain podcast about investing, but mostly applied to life beyond money. I hear that the host is pretty great. Brad eventually recognized his short-term focus. So he asked his brother Alex, "What do I need to change? What do I need to do?" His brother wisely told him, "Lots of things, my man, but none I'm going to tell you, because you won't be able to hear it from me." So not only is Alex investing well, apparently he's remarkably self-aware for a brother. He didn't leave him hanging though. Alex connected Brad with his own executive coach and mentor. This mentor had a big encouragement for Brad, that he had already nailed the most important step, recognizing the short-term cycle that he's stuck in. Now that he has the recognition nailed, identifying what the problem is, he coached him through why it matters and how to change it. And not coincidentally, that is exactly what we are going to be doing today. So, why does our time horizon matter so much? We already established that it results in wildly different returns based on what our time horizon drives us to invest or not invest in. But what are the underlying mechanisms? What does our default time horizon really change? This will be our focus for the first part of our discussion today. The second part will be on the all-important question I told you we would get to at the end of the last episode. What we can do to change, adjust, and stretch our time horizon. The first thing that our time horizon fundamentally impacts is what we see as important, what we hone in on, what we focus on, what we index on, to use investor speak. This is where lagging versus leading indicators come in. Our time horizon dictates what we pay attention to, what we consider to be important, and what we measure. We talked about lagging versus leading indicators in the past, but here is a quick refresher. Lagging indicators are things that are the result of investments that have or have not been made in the past. Today's stock price is the current result of everything investors have already processed, believed, feared, and acted on. By itself, it doesn't tell us a lot about the future direction of the business. The static account balance today does not tell you about the direction of the account. It only tells you what happened in the past to get it there. The number on the scale today might not be what you want, but it mostly tells us what has happened previously. Caring too much about lagging indicators is synonymous with a short-term focus, which means a short-term focus will result in fixating on lagging indicators. I have no idea what comes first in most cases. It is a true chicken and egg conundrum, my friends. And we can contrast those lagging indicators with leading indicators, which are the long-term steps, actions, investments that eventually result in the change, or the result. Leading indicators are what fundamental investors index on. When it comes to money investing, instead of the stock price, we're talking about real profit and real cash flow. The account balance today is important, but what's more important is this question. Is our income higher than our expenses? And what is the trajectory of that account? It's not the number on the scale, it's the reps that are being put in and will continue to be put in going forward. It's the protein goal hit for the day. It's the proper fueling, not too much and not too little. How I feel today from an energy standpoint? Lagging indicator. Whether the right reps have been put in and will continue to be put in through consistent sleep, proper recovery, proper fueling, leading indicators. Whether we currently have or feel conflict in our relationships? Lagging indicator. Intentionality, time, investments that we put into meaningful conversation and connection that will continue? Leading indicators. The important part isn't whether I feel motivated today, which is a lagging indicator. It's whether I'm practicing the skills, building the habits, and making the deposits. Short-term thinkers hyperfixate on short-term indicators like the score on the scoreboard. Long-term investors care about the leading indicators of the specific skills developed in practice. Lagging indicators tell you what already happened. Leading indicators tell you what is likely to happen if you keep going and keep practicing and keep making investments in that direction. Now let's not confuse leading indicators versus lagging indicators with fundamental versus non-fundamental. They're related, but they aren't the same thing. Leading and lagging describe timing. Fundamental and non-fundamental describe importance. Many of the most fundamental things in life, like trust, reputation, expertise, and even today's earnings, are actually lagging indicators built from years of leading investments. The lagging indicators are often the thing we are working to achieve, but they aren't the inputs themselves. Most people stuck in a short-term spiral say that they want long-term outcomes, but they obsess over the lagging indicators. Someone who is trying to be healthier may obsess over their weight when they should be focusing on exercise and macros. Long-term investors don't ignore lagging indicators. They treat them as what they are, the important but delayed signal that we are investing in the right things. And speaking of which, let's talk about fundamentals versus noise. The longer we stretch out our time horizon, the more we can see the importance of what is fundamental. This allows us to then ignore short-term noise. When we are tuned to a short-term time frame, it's not that we don't see the things that actually matter. We do see the important things, but we actually interpret those important things as noise, the distraction to be ignored. With a short-term focus, fundamental drivers become a distraction that we decide to push aside and ignore. Here's an example. With a short-term, living for the weekend focus, with our money, when we're deciding what to spend our limited amount of money on, there's that niggle in the back of our minds about our retirement, about saving for that down payment, building up that emergency fund, or paying off those credit cards. When our time dial is tuned to the short term, the fundamental, good uses of our money get tuned out to the point that they just sound like static, annoyance. With this short-term mindset, we choose gratification with our money. It's also with our dial tuned to the short term that we start seeing things like price, volatility, panic, excitement, voting, emotional reactions as the things that are important and are most deserving of our attention. We misinterpret those nagging reminders in our minds as static noise instead of the things that need our attention. If our focus is instead tuned to the long term, we are paying down those credit cards. We are saving for that retirement. We're building up that down payment fund. That is when the pull of near-term gratification and all those immediate pulls on our money are the things that become background noise and become easier to ignore. Tuned to the long term, we can clearly see the things that actually matter. In money, those things are earnings, cash flow, debt level, the competitive advantages, customer value delivered. In life, those things are truth, character, experience, the results of real effort put in for a very long time. One of the reasons the length of our focus changes how we invest is because our time horizon changes what counts and is measured as risk. We talked about risk back in episodes 18, 19, and 20. We talked about how volatility does not equal risk, and how real risk is the likelihood of permanent loss of capital, permanently losing something that we care about. But one way that time horizon factors into this is that it can change what counts as risk in our view, and where we perceive that risk is present, and which risks matter to us. One of the biggest advantages that I have in my investing career and in my job as a portfolio manager is that I do not have to be right in the short term. I don't have to be right this month, this quarter, or even this year, which is a good thing because I am rarely right this month or even this quarter. I am often right this year. I know I'm making a really good sales pitch for my expertise, aren't I? But I am very frequently right over longer periods of time, 3, 5+ year periods, because that is what I maximize for. And that is the time horizon that I am allowed to have. If I had to be right today, based on the stock trades that I make today, my risk would be enormous. What I would fixate on as risk would be completely tuned to that near-term, immediate time frame. In this case, near-term volatility becomes the biggest risk that I would try to avoid. But instead, if we're talking about investing over decades, which thankfully I am, then that short-term volatility of the market represents nothing but noise, or at most, an opportunity if it is large enough. If I have decades to be right, then I can invest for the right reasons and focus on the things that matter. The fundamentals of the business, real profits and real cash flow from valuable products and services delivered to real customers, and the growth and improvement of those over time. Our long-term time horizon is a competitive advantage in the markets. And the mindset behind this advantage is believing that near-term prices matter a lot less than the long-term fundamentals. This applies across domains of life. When it comes to our health, if we fixate on the short term, then the workout, the discomfort, the strain, the potential for getting sore or pulling a muscle can feel like the bigger risk. But as we push our time frame forward, we recognize that the bigger risk is never stressing the body, never putting it through the reps, and not giving it what it needs to adapt and grow. When it comes to our career, if we are tuned to the short term, then looking like a beginner, not knowing how to do something, or potentially making a mistake feels like the bigger risk. But with a long-term lens, we recognize that never taking that first step, never making mistakes, and never raising our hand for additional opportunity is by far the bigger risk. Time horizon also changes what we consider to be risk in our relationships. An uncomfortable conversation with our spouse feels like a big risk when our time frame is tuned to the short term. When we stretch out that time frame, we recognize that avoiding uncomfortable conversations for years or decades is what compounds a relationship account in the wrong direction. The same thing applies to parenting. A short-term time frame makes it seem like our kids being unhappy, angry, or throwing a fit is the biggest risk. But with a long-term focus, we can see that real risk is training them over and over again that whining, complaining, and escalating emotionally to get what they want works. We have to recognize that short-term comfort, avoidance of reps, and indulgence is often what creates the long-term fragility or negative account balances. Short-term discomfort and sacrifice is often what creates long-term resilience, opportunity, and large account balances. As a near universal, choosing the easier path in the short term results in the harder path in the long term, which means the reverse is also true. Choosing the harder path in the short term results in the easier path in the long term. Almost without fail, the longer the time horizon, the better the results. And almost without fail, the shorter the time horizon, the worse the results. This has to come with the caveat that not every long-term decision is good. It needs to be a good decision focused on the long term. There is definitely such a thing as a bad decision that is long-term focused. And this also doesn't mean that every short-term decision is bad. We have a lot of decisions we need to make in the short term that are about the short term, and we can make them well. And they can have positive impacts. But in general, if we want to improve how we're investing in a certain area of life, if all we did was stretch out our time horizon in terms of where we're focusing, that will result in better returns because it changes how we allocate our resources now. A short-term focus with our money results in gambling, trying to time the market, panic selling and panic buying, chasing returns, chasing fads. Whereas a long-term focus is going to result in decisions that create ownership, compounding far into the future, staying invested through the ups and downs. If the only thing Mike and Kim from our case study in episode 25 would have changed is switching from a short-term focus to a long-term focus, they would very likely have avoided the repeated catastrophes. In relationships, a short-term focus is going to result in shallowness, short-term pleasure seeking with people you're not going to have any long-term connection with, flings, casual dating with no intent. Some excitement, sure, but a lot of disappointment and emptiness. With a long-term focus, relationships are invested in. Dating seriously, focusing on getting to marriage, building commitment, cultivating trust in lives that are shared. Commitment, courtship with the intent toward marriage, and then building on a lifelong promise only exists on the long-term spectrum. If you invest in that direction often enough and for long enough, the expected payoff is massively positive. And there are both near-term rewards and long-term rewards, even though there are ups and downs. Stability, genuine love and trust, deep knowledge of another person, and someone who is a witness to your life, and who you get the honor of witnessing their whole life, not just a few fleeting moments. The short-term focus in our health results in fad diets, food hacks, cleanses, restrictions, summer body thinking, whereas a long-term focus results in sustainable nutrition, quality movement, focus on sleep and overall recovery. A short-term focus in our career results in buying credentials from a credential mill without building competence and expertise, looking for status and recognition without building skills, job hopping without any real development or real results to show for it. A long-term focus results in building expertise, building reputation, accumulating skills, solving bigger problems for more people, and generating real value as a result. The longer the time horizon, the better the inputs, and the more room there is for those good inputs to work. The shorter the time horizon, the worse the inputs, because it's more likely to be ruled by impulse, emotion, and immediate transaction. You've probably heard me reference investing versus gambling a number of times in the past. Our time horizon is one of the key things that reveals whether something we are participating in is investing or whether it is gambling. The single most important measure of whether something is likely investing or gambling is whether you are involved in a zero-sum or a positive-sum game. And those zero-sum games are typically negative-sum. Keep that in mind. Those zero and negative-sum games are gambling. Positive-sum games are investing. And it is our time horizon that is one of the strongest forces pushing us toward one game or the other. If you have to win against the competition, that is zero-sum. There is a clear winner and a clear loser. Only one person or only one team gets the win or gets the project. If, on the other hand, you participate in a growing opportunity or collaborate to build something, that is positive-sum. If you have to win an argument versus trying to understand the other person's point of view, that is zero-sum versus positive-sum. And we want to be playing positive-sum games with our investment. We'll go a lot deeper into investing versus gambling in a future episode, because there's a lot more there. But just know for now that time horizon is the first clue. And this is where we can start to distinguish between whether we should focus on something in the short term versus whether we should be focusing more on the long term. There is nuance to this discussion in that if you become a long-term maximizing machine of only ever choosing the harder path in the short term, to the exclusion of anything that looks like enjoyment or immediate gratification, you can end up hampering yourself in the long term. Because you give up many of the good, beneficial, pleasurable things that happen in the now. Because those things don't look like they're a long-term investment. And here I'd like to apply one of our recurring vested questions. For what purpose? Because our time horizons shouldn't just be arbitrarily tuned to the maximum. Without purpose, our decisions and our investments become emotional, reactive, and inconsistent. Which sure sounds like it fits cleanly into the short-term bucket. But sometimes a shorter-term time horizon is appropriate. Sometimes the now is the thing to be focused on more than the later. When we do financial planning for our clients, we need to know the time horizon, the return objective, the risk tolerance, and the constraints. And time horizon is not just longer is always better. The right time horizon depends on the purpose for the account and the opportunities and options that are available to us right now. Long term is built on deposits we make in the present. So to build long-term results, a focus on the present becomes even more important, not less. Things like saying no to the ice cream with your family might fit exactly with the long-term health focus, but it is detrimental to what is more important: genuine connection and shared experience with your family right now. Saying no to the hangout with your friend or family member because we're too busy building our long-term productive things can mean that we have a lot of resources in the future that we get to enjoy all by ourselves. And I would like to add another caveat here. We can trick ourselves into thinking that we have a long-term focus, but really we're just applying a short-term lens to our long-term fears. This is related to something that I call false long-termism. And the best way I can describe it is to give you some examples. In the stock market, there are people who are called market doomers. They are always forecasting future gloom and doom, talking about the collapse of the economy, the crash of the stock market. Many of them have successfully called 27 of the past 3 market corrections, and 13 of the past 0 economic collapses. Always being early in your forecasts that never happen eventually starts to look suspiciously similar to being wrong. What that is short-term thinking masquerading as long-term forecasting and planning. Those market doomers are almost always incredibly fear-driven, short-term minded people, but they can look wise and thoughtful by applying their immediate fear to something that they call a long-term forecast. You can identify them because the actions that they advocate for are based on a world and opportunity set that is shrinking, not growing. Those who take this approach are primarily zero-sum, negative-sum thinkers, gamblers, and fearmongers. Doomsday prepping is another example, which is pretty common in my area. Maybe it's common everywhere. That is a hyperfixation on short-term, near-term risk that drives people to do what they convince themselves is a smart long-term strategy: gathering supplies, preparing for a disastrous future where they will be the ones that survive. Some of the only ones that survive. But this is a hyper short-term focus disguised as long-term planning. These are people who obsess over potential collapse and do very little to invest toward flourishing and toward growth. In these cases, it's mostly people who confuse pessimism with wisdom. And an unfortunate quirk of our human psychology is that near-term and long-term pessimism almost always look and sound more wise and more thoughtful than near-term and long-term optimism. This, at least as I see it, is clearly rooted in that loss aversion bent that we have. We feel the pain of loss so much more strongly than we feel the pleasure of gain. So anything that sounds like protection in the short term will pull our attention. If I put out a market forecast podcast episode saying that next year is probably going to be pretty good economically, that a recession is unlikely, and that the stock market will probably post a modest gain, versus if I put out a market forecast episode that said the market is going to crash, retirement savings are going to be wiped out, massive unemployment, and maybe the collapse of the entire economy is going to happen, which one do you think will get more listens and more shares? It isn't the one that's more likely accurate, which is the boring, things are probably going to be fine, and pretty average episode. The much less likely, but fear-inducing pessimistic episode will be the one that gets far more attention. And by the way, if you want to be a successful portfolio manager, you probably don't want to be a pessimist. Short-termism can masquerade as long-termism. A calendar that extends far into the future is not the same thing as a long-term mindset. Extreme fear with a far future date attached to it does not automatically make it long-term. False long-termism projects immediate fear into the future and invests only toward avoidance. True long-termism invests toward a positive expected future payoff. And just to be clear, because I'm going to encourage you to practice the right kinds of prevention later in this episode, the problem is not preparedness or risk mitigation. The problem is obsessive fear, probability distortion, neglect of investing toward positive ends, and decisions built around a shrinking pie rather than a growing pie. That is all poor mindset driven. I said just a bit ago that if all we did was stretch out our time horizon in terms of where we're focusing, that will result in better returns. Because it changes how we allocate our resources now. And that brings us to an important paradox that we need to address. Although a long-term focus is by far the most important and what we should be targeting, long-term results are built on short-term inputs. We maximize for a long-term result by investing well right now. Right now is by definition the short term. The only way we get to the future is by living through a whole lot of present moments. And therefore, the only way we build future account balances is through a whole lot of present deposits. A multi-million-dollar account 30 years from now is built on deposits that start today and continue tomorrow. A strong marriage decades from now is not the result of investments that you are eventually going to make. It's built on the investments that are made right now, and then tomorrow, and then the next day. Having a fit body 10, 20, 30 years from now is not just the result of investments that are going to happen. They are the result of investments that are happening today and then continue. And because of that, we must embrace the short term to build a bridge into the long term. Long-term thinking doesn't mean ignoring today. It means using today correctly. Because the workout happens today. Every meal happens today. The conversation happens today. The reading and the podcast listening happens today. The deposit into our investment account happens today. The consistent bedtime and wake time happens today. Our prayers and spiritual practices happen today. This ties directly into putting in the reps that we talked about in episodes 12 and 13. Reps in the present are how returns in the future are generated. Understanding that those reps take patience, time, and discipline is how we turn the short term from a distraction, attention-pulling force into the very tool that long-term results are built on. One thing I want to make sure that we cover before I get into application is the most powerful force that can generate a short-term focus even in people who want to think long-term. So many people I talk to know that they should be focused more long-term, but they're stuck in a short-term loop. And by the way, I fit into this category myself pretty often. And that happens because of a vicious, inverse relationship between stress and time frame. I call it the stress time frame cycle. Maybe somebody can come up with a name for it that has a better ring to it, because it is such a clear and direct relationship that impacts all of us. Essentially, and I'll use me as an example, my bent is tuned more for the long term. That's a combination of practice and natural inclination, I believe. But where I find myself dialed too much to the short term is when I am highly stressed. The more worried I am, the more stressed I am, the more that pulls my focus into the present in a bad way. Not in the way that I'm looking for how to invest well in the present for the long-term results, but into the very short term, caring only about what just happened and what is about to happen. When I'm worried and stressed about something, that narrows my window of focus to the immediate and not much else. I mentioned this in the last episode, but it's worth repeating here. I struggle with my time horizon collapsing to the near present when I'm dealing with conflict, loss, and uncertainty. Again, I may be expert level in long-term time horizon in some areas, but I am kindergarten level in others. And unfortunately, those categories can change just based on my current circumstances. And the vicious cycle of it is that the more I narrow my focus to the near term, to the exclusion of long-term factors that matter, the more stressed I am and the more worried I become, which pulls my focus and investing approach even more into the short term. It's a black hole that creates its own gravity that can collapse in on itself. It's a cycle that once started and once sets in is very difficult for us to get out of. Let me try to lay out the full cycle so that it's clear. Maybe you can identify with it alongside me. Stress, loss, and/or uncertainty narrows the time horizon. The narrowed time horizon reveals more seemingly immediate threats. More perceived threats increases stress, which makes the time horizon narrow further. And on and on. We can identify it in the people around us. And hopefully we can identify it in ourselves. We can often see it in hindsight, if not in the moment. This is a big reason why the people who are struggling the most have an ultra short-term focus, and the people with an ultra short-term focus struggle the most. Which came first? It's really hard to separate those two things because they feed each other. It's the chicken and egg problem that we identified earlier. And unfortunately, in those extreme cases, we can convince ourselves that we cannot focus on anything beyond right now. That is what we need to worry about. And in some cases, that's true. When we have an immediate problem that needs to be addressed, we need to address it in the near term. But when we can't think beyond the next 12, 24, 36 hours, that takes investing well off the table. It removes our opportunity to have good long-term results. This is the pattern that you see in people's lives around you that are struggling the most. We know that if they would just tune their time horizon to be days instead of 2-day, or instead of hours, then they could maybe have some opportunity to make better decisions, to get a win. But we need to keep in mind that this stress timeframe cycle applies to all of us. So, how do we pull ourselves out of it? How the heck do we deal with the stressors and extend our time horizon? This is when we can get into application. And the first step I want to talk about is to apply a bit of prevention. Avoidance can be a good strategy, especially when it's avoiding bad things happening. Long-term investors are not merely focused on building big account balances or fixing big problems. Oftentimes, they're even better at avoiding short-term overdraws or preventing problems from popping up in the first place. And this prevention focus is powerful in terms of avoiding that short-term stress spiral that can keep us locked into negative returns with an extremely near-term focus. And what I'm talking about are things that allow you to sidestep the most common stressors that life throws at us. For example, when it comes to money, having that emergency fund in place that prevents the financial emergency from happening in the first place. We know unexpected expenses are coming. So let's not subject ourselves to the stress when they come when we don't have enough money to address even the little ones. It is truly amazing the amount of stress that is reduced just by having a few months of expenses in the bank. And for someone just starting on a path of better financial and life management, just having a few $1,000s in the bank is a massive unlock. When someone can go from a $1,000 unexpected expense being an all-consuming emergency to it just being a minor inconvenience, that is where a little bit of money can truly be life-changing. And it starts with saving $20 today. It doesn't have to wait until you can make a $1,000 deposit, because that first $1,000 is built on a bunch of $20 deposits. So what do you have that you can invest today? That is how you start. And that is a really good application of this prevention strategy. Applied in another direction, it would be focusing on building healthy habits and basic movement practices to avoid the health problems, pains, injuries, and lack of energy that are the result of not doing those basic things. Another powerful area of prevention is to focus on consistently building skills and trying to add real value in your job or career so that job loss doesn't become an immediate reality that produces a crisis in the near term. Just treating the job as a field of opportunity will put the average person head and shoulders above the rest. And this can apply to all sorts of different areas of life that we could spend all day dissecting. But essentially, the lens that we need to look through is this. Where can we prevent crises or stresses from happening in the first place with relatively small investments now? We've all heard the phrase, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. But I think that undersells it. In many cases, pennies of prevention are worth many dollars of cure. Oftentimes, the cure is not solving an existing problem. It's preventing the problem from happening in the first place. So we should look for those areas where there is low-hanging disaster fruit, about ready to fall, and apply some basic prevention. Because when those disasters happen, that is the biggest driver of that short-term stress spiral that keeps us fixated on the immediate to the exclusion of good results that can be built. Another thing we can do is identify where we are fixating on lagging indicators and replace them with leading indicators. When we recognize a short-term focus, Consciously replacing more of those lagging indicators with leading indicators that actually matter in the long term will make a major difference in pushing out your time horizon. Some examples. Instead of obsessing over the daily weight on the scale, start tracking your daily protein, your step count, and sleep consistency. Did we get our grams of protein in for the day? Did we get our steps in? Did we go to bed and wake up at a consistent and adequate time? You might think that that won't do much, but that is replacing a lagging indicator with much more effective leading indicators. That alone will pull your attention out of the short term and will affect behavior change and bring results over time. Just by shifting our focus in that direction, it will result in the thing that you ultimately want, which is a healthier body, and very likely, the scale weight heading in the right direction over time. Instead of obsessing over the lagging indicators of our bank account balance or our portfolio value, track the leading indicators of whether we have positive cash flow. Are we consistently making deposits into our investment accounts? Related on the money side, instead of indexing on the lagging indicator of stock price, focus on whether the companies that you own are really growing their profits and cash flow. When we notice we're fixating on lagging indicators, let's instead start measuring the leading indicators that are most likely going to produce the results that we want. In addition to the prevention focus and adjusting our indicators, I also want to give you a specific tool that you can use. I mentioned earlier that we can stretch our time horizon the same way that we can stretch and grow a muscle. We train them under load through repeated repetition. And if we want to identify a short-term focus or investment pattern that is likely going to have negative returns, we just have to game it out over progressively longer periods. This helps us to identify short-term patterns that are going to cause problems for us or are not going to do us any favors. So here's how we use the time ladder. If we're obsessing over something for 10 minutes, then we need to ask ourselves, what is this going to matter? Or what is this going to look like in 10 hours? How about 10 days? And then step forward the time scale from there. What about 10 months? And then what about 10 years? Some people will roll their eyes at the 10-year question and say, I have problems in the present that I need to address right now. Nothing I'm dealing with would matter in 10 years. So what's the point of this exercise? Well, that's exactly the point. We need that reframe from the immediate. As soon as the problem that you're thinking about, that you're ruminating on, that's stressing you out, that's pulling your attention and resources into that short-term cycle, we need a way of kicking ourselves out of that. For many of us, our days are built out of different 10-minute chunks of ruminating and stressing over different things. The reason we counter the immediate 10-minute stress with stepping out to 10 years is because it pours cold water on that seemingly immediate flame of emergency and stress. And it can be a very effective slap to the face. And it's not an exercise to show that the next 10 minutes doesn't matter, or that the problem that we're facing right now doesn't matter. It probably does. But it needs to be in perspective. And again, because long-term results are built on short-term inputs, the next 10 minutes does matter. A fire is a fire. But what we tend to do to ourselves when we're in that near-term stress spiral is hold a lit match right up to the front of our face so that all we see is fire, but we don't see it in context. The context is, yes, it is fire, but it is also just a little match, a little flame. We're just holding it really, really close. What we will find is, as we step forward our focus from 10 minutes to asking the question, what about 10 hours? What about 10 days? Does it matter? 10 months? Interestingly and usefully, we often realize that the problem we're stressing about probably won't matter even 10 days from now. And even if the answer is, yes, it's still a problem at the 10-day mark, then that is a very useful thing to know, because then we can ask ourselves, what can I do now in the present to solve for that 10 days from now? Which gets us to the action phase. We need to put in some reps. Because the best cure for that cycle of worry and rumination is taking action. When all we're doing is cycling through worry and stress, that becomes much harder to do in an active state. And if you want a deep dive into how we can identify and take action on the unit of the rep, You can go back and listen to episodes 12 and 13. They're some of my favorites, but they also happen to be some of the most under-listened to in the catalog so far. So statistically, there's an excellent chance that you haven't heard them yet. Here's another tool, a variation of the time ladder that we just talked about. And that is the 10-year projection test. This can be applied in a really powerful way. It allows us to project our future returns, and with accuracy. We tend to think that future forecasting is difficult to do. I don't think that it is. One of the reasons that many of us ignore the long term is because it seems ambiguous, unknowable, and scary. But I believe it is quite knowable, because all the long term is where we eventually get to after our short-term inputs are all added up. Once we've identified our short-term investments, the deposits that are happening right now, all we need to do is ask ourselves, if this became my pattern for 10 years, what would the account balance look like? That is where a long-term lens can powerfully impact our near-term inputs. If eating this way became my pattern for 10 years and would result in disaster for my health, then I shouldn't pretend that the pattern is harmless just because each individual meal or weekend feels isolated. If talking to your wife or your girlfriend that way became your pattern for the next 10 years and would destroy the relationship, then that tells us something very important about the way we are speaking right now. If spending money this way became the pattern for 10 years and would result in being broke, then we shouldn't pretend that each purchase exists in isolation. If coasting in our career became the pattern for 10 years and would leave us irrelevant, stuck, or at a dead end, then we need to reconsider the inputs that we're practicing now. If giving in to your complaining or fit-throwing kid became the pattern for 10 years and is likely to produce a monster a decade from now, be cautious about repeatedly reinforcing it right now. The 10-year test doesn't mean that every single action has massive, catastrophic, or pivotal importance. It means that looking at our present actions as repeated patterns over a long time frame will reveal their true nature and their true value. It reveals what those inputs are likely to build and whether we should keep practicing them. Again, it's not always hard to forecast, to predict future returns. The repeated near-term inputs will usually tell us what we need to know. My hope is that these past 2 episodes on time horizon will result in a perspective shift for those who need it and a bit of behavior change for all of us. Let's close out the story of the brothers, Brad and Alex. With the help of his coach, Brad is making progress. He still struggles with short-term focus in a lot of areas because that's what he's practiced for the longest time. But he's actively practicing swapping his lagging indicators for leading indicators. He's asking, how do I want to feel next year and not just how do I feel right now, which has impacted his schedule and his movement for the better. Instead of avoiding conflict and uncomfortable conversations, he's started leaning into them so that his relationships don't become defined by silent resentment and drifting apart. He's looking at how he can prevent problems by investing well in the short term, rather than just living in reaction when things go wrong or get thrown at him. And when he's deciding how he's going to allocate his precious and valuable resources of time, energy, and money, he's playing the 10 minutes to 10 years game. If this became my investment pattern for 10 years, what would the account balance look like? Through doing this, Brad's life isn't suddenly transformed, but his returns are starting to move in the right direction. His focus on the leading indicators are impacting his trajectory, even though the lagging results will take time to show up. One of the most important things about our time horizon is that in the short term, returns are mostly linear, additions and subtractions. Compounding, exponential growth, only exists in the long term, which is annoying because most of us would prefer exponential growth by this Thursday. But if we invest well in the present with that long-term focus in mind, we should be able to see the direction that we're going and the likely returns that we will get, the magnitude of which can be enormous. And that should be pretty darn motivating to keep us investing for the long term. Okay, thank you for investing in yourself and in those around you. I will talk to you next time. I'm told that asking for ratings and reviews on the podcast platform you're listening on works. And if you would, I would really appreciate it. We'll check the lagging indicator of that over the next week.